Assalamu alaikum. It is now my pleasure to introduce the final presentation of BX 2025 here in the Black Box by Professor Eric Johnson. Professor Johnson is a professor of business and the director of the Center for Decision Sciences at the Columbia Business School. He's a pioneer in choice architecture theory and decision-making, and the author of the book Elements of Choice. You can pick up a copy of his book after the session. Today, Professor Johnson will share insights from his world-leading research, exploring how choice architecture, the way choices are presented, influences decision-making, highlighting how and why subtle factors can lead to better or worse outcomes. He will also cover practical applications of these principles in various fields, including public policy, business, and personal decision-making. Professor Johnson, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's exciting, and I want to thank you all for coming and for everyone for going all this way to travel. It's an exciting opportunity, and I appreciate it very much. I want to tell you a story about a book and a topic that's obsessed me for probably 30 years. And it essentially is called choice architecture. All choices have a hidden partner. Every time you make a choice, someone has been there beforehand who's made a bunch of decisions. Let me give you one example. A plane cockpit is actually interesting. They've actually carefully designed where each of those controls go, and this is literally a matter of life and death. So luckily, they don't actually test this by flying. They test it with flight simulators until they get it right. Luckily, they do that instead of actually losing people to the experiments. Policymakers are choice architects. They often make decisions about how to present options to people. And my favorite example of late has been in the New York City school system. We give people, high school kids at 8th grade, a choice of many high schools to decide where they go to high school. Now, the choice architecture of that will be very interesting, as we'll see in a second. And finally, you each have the consequence of an important choice architecture in your back pocket, and that's your phone. Almost all of you who have an iPhone, 90% of you plus, actually have Google as the default search engine in your browser. This has been a function of a huge court case in the US, and it turns out it's revealed that Google pays Apple $20 billion a year, not to be the required search engine, simply to be the default search engine. This is a huge economic consequence. So basically, you might start feeling picked upon now that the person I'm going to call the designer who actually makes these options is picking you. But here's some news. You're all designers. When it comes to your family, your friends, your team, you actually make the design for presenting choices. So when my wife and I talk about where to go to dinner, I think about how many options am I going to present her, what order I'm going to present them, and am I going to really give that restaurant that she loves and I hate in the list. So we are all choice architects. And when we're doing that, we make a set of decisions. One decision we make, which I think is really important, is how many options to present. Do I present 2, 3, 5, all that are available? A second one is basically, how do I order the options? What's first? Think about the school. Should I do it by distance from the student? Should I do it by quality of the school? Should I do it by other things? I have to make a decision about how to do that. There's also a question of which attributes. What are the qualities of the options I present? So for example, in the school system, do I say, what percentage of kids graduate or go to college? I have to make that decision as a designer, and so on and so forth. And all of these decisions can influence what the chooser ends up choosing. So I argue it's an illusion that we alone determine what is chosen. The choice architect, or who I'll call the designer for short, is a person who's largely making those choices. And that's important. And it's both a tool, and it's one that we're very much unaware of its influence. Okay, I came across this quote as I was writing the book that I just fell in love with. So let's move from choice architecture to architecture. Winston Churchill had this great quote, which is, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards, our buildings shape us. So here's the very interesting part of that, is Churchill was talking about the House of Commons, a building that dated to the 15th century, and it was destroyed by the Nazis in one of the last bombings of the Blitz. And so they had to rebuild. And many people thought this was a great opportunity to do something very modern. Maybe we hire a great star architect to do something. And Churchill, in one of his better speeches, said, no, absolutely not. Now, it's not because he loved the wonderful architecture there, but he thought that building shaped the way that Parliament ran. Notice a couple things about this. First thing, notice there are exactly two sides. You look at many buildings for parliamentary bodies, they're semicircle. The two sides, he argues, is key to keeping the British interested in two parties. You're either on one side or the other. And attention is focused not on your colleagues, but on the opposition. The second thing I think is interesting is this red line. It looks very meaningless. It turns out you cannot go over that line by the rules of Parliament. In fact, it turns out they're exactly 2 sword lengths apart. Remember, we're talking about the 15th century now. And that was a way to keep the sides from actually getting into duels. It's also the origin of the English phrase, to toe the line. You can't go past that. The third thing Churchill said is, look, I know the building's too small. We have 600 members of Parliament, only 500 seats. But when things get really interesting, they get really crowded. And that's really good because it creates excitement. So they recreated the building just as it was. So if this is how architecture influences behavior, a really good question is, how does choice architecture influence behavior? I want to tell you a story about a former student who worked as a medical informatist. Now, what's a medical informatist? They design our new friend in all encounters with doctors, the electronic health record. If you're a doctor, you might recognize this. Essentially, it turns out doctors, of course, used to write things in pads and notes. Now, of course, they do all the entries in these electronic records. About a third of a doctor's time, the typical encounter, is dealing with this. Now, the interesting thing is, there's another problem. There are 2 kinds of prescribed drugs. There are drugs that are generic and drugs that are actually brand name. The nice thing about generic drugs is they're much cheaper. In fact, I take a seasonal allergy drug called Allegra, and that costs about $1 a pill. If I use generic, which is called phenylphexidine hydrochloride, and I had to practice a long time to be able to say that quickly. If I took a phenylphexidine hydrochloride, 20 cents. And the important thing is not just for hospitals to save money, but if drugs are cheaper, patients are more compliant. They don't stretch pills by doing every other stuff, things like that. So it turns out there was a real advantage to doing generics. What our former student said is, there's exactly no way we get people to change drugs. In her hospital, about 90% of the prescriptions were actually for the brand name drug. Despite the fact they put reminders, they would pop up saying, please, please use the generic. And what our friend Jennifer Anker says is it became like a video game. How quickly can they make the alert go away? Totally useless. So we needed to do a really good idea. She needed a really good idea about what was happening. And it turns out the problem was doctors don't know the names of the generic drugs. If you think about it, when a drug is introduced, you get pens with the drug's name on it. You get prescription tabs with the drug's name on it. There's lots of advertising. There's salespeople. So you quickly learn that Allegra is the name of the drug. When it becomes generic and it becomes fexofenadine hydrochloride, doctors don't know that. So it turns out, a very simple solution. If I started typing Allegra, it would pre-populate with the name of the generic. This took from 46% generics to 90% generics, and they stayed there. Doctors could override it. It was not a mandate, but they kept it. This illustrates really the 2 key principles, I think, of choice architecture. And that is basically the fact that people do what's easy. We've heard that many times today. But there's a specific sense in which I want to say that. They choose what information to look at very early on in the decision, and they tend to stick with it. It's not that they keep saying, is this easy, is this easy? It's easy to say, oh, this path is easy, I'm going to stick with it. So that's the first thing. And that's really about external search, what we look at. There's a second really important part of choice architecture that I think is a bit neglected. And that's the idea that the choice architecture changes what we think about. that many of our decisions and beliefs are formed at the point of questioning. And the choice architecture doesn't provide the information, but it changes how we think about the problem and what we think about. Let me give you a quick example of each. This is a very, to me, famous and maybe infamous study that was done at Columbia by some economists. It turns out New York cabs went from old style, no one here remembers it, meters they would rotate, to actually electronic meters. And what you saw was something that went like this. On your right side, you see there's one that says 15, 20, 25 suggested tips. The other side says 20, 25, 30 suggested tips. Now, this is very easy to change. If I wanted to tip $10, I go 1, 0.00 return. But it turns out not only did nobody do that, but that the cabs that had the higher menu ending in 30 ended up in a 5% greater paycheck to the cabbies. Now, if you are ever using an online service these days that gives a suggested tip, or if you go to any coffee shop that has suggested menu, you'll see this in action. So since 2006, this has become almost the de rigueur for providing tip information. So that's interesting, and it has a big effect, even though it would be very easy to change. We started looking at this in another domain that I thought was interesting, and that was COVID tracking apps. If you remember back in the pandemic, one of the proposed solutions was basically to take your phone and say, we're going to just keep track of who you've talked to. And by combining all that information, we can say you've been in contact with somebody with COVID or not. The problem was nobody was enabling this. And when we started looking at these were incredibly complicated contracts. You wouldn't want to read them. But in essence, there was something very interesting, is you had to say yes or 3 or 4 times to get it to work. But sort of more importantly, we look at how they had framed it. So as you can see here, there's one phrase which we're going to call the opt-in, I should actually say air quotes for this, opt-in presentation, which is continue without enabling. And the other is this, which is continue. Okay, both seem to make sense. You only have to press one button. Notice this is not a default. You have to make a choice, right? So we're not imposing a choice on anyone, perhaps, but certainly that's a reasonable question. And what happens is basically this one makes continue without enabling seem to be the salient thing. And notice it's in blue, which on most iOS devices means you continue. And this one, it's continue. How big of a difference do you think that little change would make? Well, we've done a couple of studies. We've shown this in lots of places other than COVID tracking. But here on your right, on your left, is if I had opt in, it's about 27%. If I had opt out, it's about 80% agreeing. This is almost as big as the effects you get in default. And this is just changing the color and the wording of the choice. So again, plausible pass. It's easy. People do it. And in fact, I was taking a nap a few days ago and noticed that when I got my alarm, it looked like iOS wanted me to take a nap, another nap, because notice, snooze is in yellow, stop is in a sort of not so obvious shade of purple. So that's a plausible path. I hope everybody's following that. Let me talk about another, I think, really important aspect of what drives choice architecture. And I'm going to call that assembled preferences. What do I mean by that? It says that often when we're asked questions about our preferences or about life in general, we don't have a pre-stored answer. We're actually trying to retrieve things from memory. And along with Elke Weber, we've done work on a theory called query theory. And let me tell you a little bit about an application. The most important single decision, according to economists, that you need to make before you make other decisions is you have to decide how long you're going to live. If you're deciding how much to save, of course, you're deciding how much do I have to insure myself for. If I'm deciding whether to go to college, I should think about how long I live. Crazy, but that's how economists think. Now, it turns out in national surveys, they ask the question, what's the probability that you'll live to age 85 or older? But we thought of another way you could ask that question, which is, what's the probability that you will die by age 85 or younger? Now, you're smart and realize quickly those are essentially the same question. The probability of one is one minus the other. But in query theory, we actually have an idea. that when I think about someone who, and I'm asking them, when you will die by, you're going to look a little bit more like this guy. You think about, oh, my back is hurting. I smoked for 2 weeks in college. I haven't exercised for a couple months. And my Aunt Edna died at 32. Okay. So you retrieve very different things because of the label die by. The person who's been asked to live to question, on the other hand, thinks about, and they, by the way, they think they'll die by 75. The people in the live to question think about, well, I exercised last week, and there are all new medical developments happening all the time that are going to help me. And there's Uncle Fred, and Uncle Fred lived a healthy 102. Literally, when we ask people what they're thinking about, they think about different things. Now, this makes a difference because these folks think they'll live to 84.9, almost a 10-year difference. So simply changing the phrasing of the question changes the answer. And you might notice this has a lot like framing manipulations. I think this process is what's underlying many framing manipulations. And that's a talk for another day, but that's what query theory is about. Okay. So what this does is generate a toolbox for designers. I've shown you two principles of how choice architecture might work. Let me show you how the tools might change behavior. The first is going to be the power of defaults, and for many of you, this will be a review. But Dan Goldstein and I wrote a paper in 2003 called Do Defaults Save Lives, where we simply did an early version of the opt-in, opt-out question, and this was about organ donation. Here is the results of actual agreement to be a donor rates in, so you guys can see this, in some European countries. Here's the rate in other countries. That huge effect is due mostly to the way the question is phrased. In these questions in blue, you're asked, do you want to become an organ donor? In the green bars, you're asked, do you want to opt out of being a donor? As you can see, there's a big difference. Now, I'm showing you this for two reasons. It's sort of a greatest hit, but there's another reason. And that is, I think, A, it's a mistake to think that this alone is enough. You'll find colleagues who say, this has solved the organ donation problem. The problem is there's many steps, and this is an important part of behavioral science, is yes, you will do the form and change it. But then other things happen. Like in the US, you're always asked, your family is always asked, and they may not know your wish. So it's more complex. We don't get these one-hit wonders very often. The second thing is we ask people, basically these two conditions, and then we asked a third group, basically, what would you do if you were forced to make a choice? Not opt in, not opt out, but you actually mandated choice. And it turns out 79% said they would actually want to be a donor. This is important because it tells you something that's fundamentally important about defaults. It says that the default for most people should be the opt-out condition because that's what they would want to happen. Okay, so that, I think, is an important thing because it says choice architecture could play one way or the other. But what's really important here is to think about what would people really want if they were forced to choose. So that's, I think, a really important lesson. Okay, another tool, another decision we get to make is how many options do we present people? And it's actually interesting because there's two things that are going on here. There's a blessing, which is I add more options, you get options that might be better for you, that you might fit better. But the other thing is a negative thing, the curse. There are more and more options that are presented and more I have to think about. The reality, there are two forces, and actually the choice architecture decides which one is harder. Many options, it's going to be choice overload. Too few options, I'm not going to have enough choices. Let me talk a little bit of some real-world policy cases. First one is going to be Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. This was in 2014. The United States decided to provide health insurance choices in a market for people who met a certain income standard. Different states had very different beliefs about the right number of options. In Alaska and Mississippi, there were 5. In New York State, there were 8. Utah said they believed in choice. They gave people 124 different options. Clearly, one number there is better than the others, but I don't know which one of those, but we can talk about that. I want to talk about another example, which I like a lot, though, which is New York City school choice. Now, you could, in fact, in theory, present people with high schools, and this is an economist's dream. It's designed by a Nobel Prize-winning, almost said choice architect, economist, now Al Roth. Let me skip ahead one slide. What is the right number of schools? It turns out in New York City, a student could pick between 769 different high schools. And so what did New York City do? They produced a book, yes, a book, a telephone book-like, with all 769 schools ordered alphabetically. So I kid that here's a Nobel Prize-winning economist who, by the way, grew up in the New York City school system. His parents were both high school teachers, neglecting his roots. He didn't realize that many kids would be totally overwhelmed by this choice. In fact, by the way, the response was you had to rank the 10 schools, not just pick one. You had to rank the 10 because there's some fancy market mechanism going on. Now, could we do better? I think 769 clearly is too much choice. What would you think if I said 3? You might say that's not enough choice because we need to know something about the kid and their parents, their talents. Not every kid wants to go to one of those 3 high schools. So there's been some work where they've actually said, let's do a little bit of choice architecture here. We're going to give you only the schools that are within a half-hour commute from your home. Seems pretty sensible. We're going to eliminate all those schools that have low graduation rates. One of the goals here was basically to drive schools that were not performing well out of business because no one would go there. So that would make it easier to do that. And finally, another trick, it wasn't done in this study, but I think is very useful, and I shouldn't say trick, another tool is to actually give people all 769, but on another page. So here's 30. If you want to see more, click here. Nobody does, but what that does is preserve a sense of autonomy, that people feel there's nothing being taken away from them. So this is good. The result here are the matches are much better. People end up getting to schools that are objectively better for them than in the 769 book category. There's even a better solution, which will get me to sort of one of our topics in a second. That is, I could do a smart choice set. I could ask you 2 or 3 questions, like, are you trying to go to college, yes or no? Are you trying to go to vocational school, yes or no? And reduce the set. Do you want to commute more than 15 minutes? And once I did that, I could actually give you a much smaller set. So choice architects could actually do a lot to produce better outcomes in number of options. Okay. Let me give you one other example, and that is we have to describe the options. So a very famous piece of research done by Rick Larrick and Jack Soll essentially asked people questions like this. Imagine there are 3 people who drive 10,000 miles per year. Now, I'm going to use the American data and description because it's important. Person A drives a car that gets 10 miles per gallon. Person B drives a car that gets 16.5 miles per gallon. And person C gives you 33 miles per gallon. Okay, everybody understand that? Now we're going to have them buy new cars. Person A is going to go to 11 miles per gallon. Person B is going to go to 20 miles per gallon. And person C is going to go to 50 miles per gallon. Okay, now let me ask you a question. Who do you think is saving more gas? Most people, I'm not going to embarrass you, but you're thinking C, right? Wrong. In fact, all 3 are saving exactly the same amount of gas. It turns out it's nonlinear. So if I go from 10 to 11 miles per gallon, I'm going gallons per 100 miles from 1,000 gallons to 900, saving exactly 100 gallons. If let's go to the other extreme, 33 to 50 is going from 300 gallons to 200 gallons. The amount saved in each case is exactly the same. The thing that's tricky here is the miles per gallon label is nonlinear. I'll just mention one other very famous nonlinear scale because it's important, and we deal with it every day, interest rates. People have a very hard time doing compound interest in their head, and we have a whole line of research looking at whether you present people with the financial outcomes or with the interest rates. This has been incredibly quickly adopted. That's the old US label. In 2012, the United States adopted this label, which is complicated, but I'll just point out down here, it actually has starting to start the gallons per mile. So within 3 years, actually the federal label for gasoline mileage changed. Okay. Another example is European labels for energy efficiency. I love these because they're easy to understand. You see the track-like coloring. D is obviously a bad. These are dishwashers, and A is probably good. One interesting thing here is why do you think there's A+, A++, and A triple plus? My students say we should do this. It's called grade inflation, right? I don't want an A, I want an A triple plus. But it turns out as more energy efficient appliances came on board, they didn't want to hurt the D's and give them F's. They decided to give the new ones A+, A double plus. This is a lovely label, but it has a problem. Energy efficiency is inherently an economic decision. I don't want just to go from B to A. I want to save money, and this doesn't let me figure out how much money I'm going to save. There's actually lots of room here for an alternative, which is actually to think about what would be the price I would save in energy efficiency. And you could even imagine doing a calculation saying after 10 years there's a break even. So there's a lot of room for development here. But this is a good example of how the way you describe the options will make a difference in choice. Final thing I want to talk about is actually choice engines. We've basically talked about this as if it was all on paper. But in fact, the reality is we're dealing with websites that are choice engines that actually present us with options. And they have three advantages. The first one is you can customize them. You could have a small default. So if I knew that Eric was a vegetarian, I'd only present the vegetarian dishes for him. I can give the customer control. They could decide schools should be sorted by distance or by quality. And finally, I can increase comprehension. You've all seen balloon over or help where you go over something you don't understand or a little question mark and it helps you. This is actually a very powerful thing. But not all choice engines are built for customers. And I'll just give you one example. Netflix. I love Netflix. Many of us do. But Netflix does a landing page. They customize. They produce in the course of a year 30 million landing pages customized to different market segments. And just to give you an idea of what the choice architecture they have to do is, you see here, there's first, what is the order of these rows? What is the label of each of these rows? What is the position of each of the films within the row? Kind of interesting. They do experiments, for example, and it turns out the things in the middle get picked more often. Now, if we had more time, I'd tell you a long story what Netflix is trying to do, but it's not present you exactly the best movie for you. It's trying to present you the best movie for you that's cheap for them to rent or produce. Okay, so they actually have a slightly different goal than yours. The other goal they have is to keep you watching. And anyone who's used Netflix knows that there's a feature that you don't like very much. What happens if you don't click on something very quickly? It starts playing. Most people find that annoying. And until about 2 years ago, this was not a default, it was a mandate. Now, making things hard, it turns out if you go really down deeply in the menu, you can find the switch to not autoplay. So you've learned something today that might be useful. But it's also showing that what Netflix is trying to do is keep you involved, not necessarily make you the happiest person on earth. Okay, let me wrap up by saying two quick things. First thing is you might be thinking choice architecture is of dubious ethical effects because, after all, you're changing what people choose. I want to point out that you're changing what people choose no matter what you do. It can be either haphazard. In the school case, some school districts change things alphabetically. That's great for the A schools, not so great for the students. Okay? And the second thing is it turns out that, for the most part, choice architecture has its biggest effect on those who are most vulnerable. Those who are least financially literate, those who know less about schools. And in fact, if you don't do choice architecture, if you don't think about what it's doing, you're affecting those people actually more than people who are well off. In fact, the argument I make is not the question is using choice architecture ethical. It really is avoiding choice architecture is actually something that's awful to do. Okay. If you want to read more, there's a book, and I would love to talk to you more about it after the break. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you so much for these fascinating insights. I don't think anyone here is going to think about choices the same way again. To the audience, the final event scheduled for the Black Box is our strategic decision-making workshop at 2:30. Note that this workshop is only for people who got confirmations through their emails. I now invite you to enjoy some lunch, explore our BI gallery and calibration center, both of which can be found outside of the Blue Theater, and thank you.